Dear listeners, thank you for organizing this conference. Today, I would like to talk about multilingualism and education in historical Mukachevo Eparchy on the example of the bilingual work of one professor, Basilovich. In the eastern part of Hungary, two liturgical and literary languages with their own historical development of churches and traditions met, Latin and Slavic Byzantine. At the turn of the 18th and the 19th centuries, both languages met in the center of Greek Catholicism in the eparchy of Mukachevo, where they fulfilled the need not only for a liturgical language, but also for an administrative and literary language. Latin was still the liturgical language of the Catholic Church and the official language in Hungary, and the cultural language of the educated in Europe. On the other hand, Church-Slavonic, also a liturgical language with elements of the vernacular, was used both as the eparchy's office language and as a literary language. Bilingual Latin and Church-Slavonic works are fascinating artifacts from the intersection of Latin and Slavic cultures from this area. These texts often served both liturgical and educational purposes, especially in regions where Slavic languages were being standardized and used alongside Latin, the language of the Catholic Church. These works reflect the cultural and religious syncretism of the time, illustrating how language can serve as a bridge between different cultural identities. While in Hungary Kingdom, both languages had also the bonding character of a multicultural environment. Not only we are talking about 18th, 19th century, so Ukrainian, Slovak, Ruthenian, Serbian, Russian, also multi-religious. One significant example is parallel bilingual work of the professor, historian, and spiritual formator, Basilovich, with his work Tolkovanije, Sviaščenie liturgii, Nového zákona, and in Latin, Explicatio Sacrae Liturgiae, Nove Legis Veri. It's from 1815. This work was preserved as manuscriptum, which was in institute, our institute, edited a few years ago. Himself was deeply involved in the comprehensive education of Basilian students. His work is commentary on the liturgy of Saint John Chrysostom, Saint Basil the Great, and the liturgy of the presanctified gifts, with emphasis on the bloodless sacrifice. The work has an apologetic character in which the author explains in 3 chapters of 500 about pages the historical development of the liturgy, the polemical argument regarding to the unbloody sacrifice, and the text of the liturgies with commentary. Also, the work is largely a compendium, the author's use of Latin authors, and the selection of certain passages represent an aspect of his reality that he wished to convey to his readers or listeners. The work is therefore also didactic. It is obvious that the work is written into languages. So who was the recipient? We assume that it was a Latin-speaking person who understood the liturgical work, a member of the Latin Church. At the same time, the recipient could also have been a member of the Protestant Church, since Basilovich himself refers to Protestants several times in his work. The clergy of the Eastern Rite, who was studying at the Latin schools before, often had insufficient education of their rite, also had the Latin education. Therefore, it was the Cyrillic written part that could serve to educate not only their rite, but also its ancient language. And Basilovich was a professor. At the age of 47, he was elected as a protoigumen of all Basilians in the Eparchy of Mukachevo. So he was not only spiritual formator, but also an important historian, liturgist, and exponent of ascetic monastic life. Other works he wrote usually in Latin, the monumental works. So this is why he's called like Herodotus of Mukachevo Eparchy, or one of our first historians. Fundatio, Res Notitia Fundationis Koriatovic. It's a very big historical work. And Imago Vitae Monastice, it's a Latin work, but also translated later to the Church-Slavonic, and it's about, it was for monarchs, like rules for monarchs. It was translated now in our institute. Interesting is that all his Latin works are also apologetical. So he was talking to Europe, I mean, to Protestants, to Roman Catholic, what he needed. But let's go back to our Explicatio. As we said, we are talking about 19th century, but it's still the first liturgical commentary known from that part of Hungary Kingdom, but from the Byzantine Rite. This liturgical verse reflects the need also of the Church and serve to educate the clergy of the Eastern Rite, which after graduating from Latin Western school was lagging behind in their knowledge of the Eastern Church, as we can see from one of the letters of Bishop Andrew Baczynski, where he writes, "I see with pain in my heart that many sons of parents, after many years out of Latin schools, come for examinations and want to enter the clergy, but they are very neglectful in their knowledge of Russian. It's Ruska, it's not Russian in our geographical meaning, but in Byzantine, right? In their knowledge of Slavic doctrine, and they come so stupid that they can neither read nor write their names, nor open their mouths in church doctrine. Without this, they cannot enter the clergy. They need to begin to learn Russian doctrine in the seminary from the very beginning." So we see it was necessary. They needed priests. They send them to the schools. They come back. It costed a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of people, and they came back and they couldn't use them because it's like they couldn't read. They didn't know the right because the universities were in Latin. Also on the basis of the above, we believe that one of the reasons why the above work was written bilingually is the fact that the graduates of Latin schools, while studying the parallel text, were simultaneously educated in the Church-Slavonic language and ritual terminology. At the same time, the Latin text could make the work accessible to a wider circle of scholars from a Latin or Protestant church. So now I would like to show you on the example of Lexis, how was he working with some terms, terminology. I was comparing like Latin part and with with the authors he used. I took the three biggest one. It was like Goar, whose Euchologian was written in Greek, but parallel with Latin. Also with Lebrun and Tompa. Tompa was Slovak, like in Slovakia, in Bratislava, and his book is small, but how it's also a little bit written about Greek Catholic rite. We observe the extent to which the two parallel texts coincide. Initial analyses have already shown that Basilovich modified the Latin text not only stylistically, but also lexically. To illustrate this ritual and linguistic symbiosis, we have chosen some lexemes for to comparison of the Latin lexis. Basilovich, in comparison with the above-mentioned authors, replaced the Latin lexemes used in the prefaces with Greek ones, which are typical for the Eastern ritual environment. These ones are, for example, so we see when, for example, Tompa was talking about templum, church, Basilovich in the Latin part changed it to ecclesia. Or we are talking about procession, processio nocturna. He took epitaphion or calc with in the Church-Slavonic. Hostia, we know hostia is typical for Latin rite. It's bread. And he changed it to prospora. Missa, liturgia. Stella, it's the same meaning, but he changed from the Greek asteriscum, patena, discus, purificatorium, spongia. Pallium, homophorium. It's very interesting to see for the things we can see, like clothes or liturgical dishes. Very interesting is when is he using Greekism in the alphabet, Greek alphabet. There are only few parts where he already uses the Greek alphabet, and it's usually on the parts where there are some discussion between Latin and Greek Catholic. For example, we see here about the bread. For example, in explaining the use of leavened and unleavened bread, one of the ritual differences between Greek Catholic and Roman Catholic. He uses the lexeme artos, gives its meaning in the context of scripture, and then the development in both Eastern and Western tradition, respecting this different development. So I will try to translate this. For the Greek word artos, bread means high bread, as it leavened. From this, they wrongly conclude that the leaven belongs to the nature of bread. For in order to understand the meaning of the terms, it is not so much their origin as their use that must be examined, and this use is described in scripture, so that even leavened bread is called artos. For Luke, he says that the two disciples at Emmaus recognized the Lord in the breaking of bread. So, two are two. Now it is clear that this bread was unleavened bread, because it happened in the days of unleavened bread. It is like Basilovich defense of both sides, that both are correct. You know, when they are arguing, or nowadays Orthodox meaning, for example. What about Church-Slavonic part? It's interesting because we thought the terminology in Church-Slavonic part will be the Slavic, but compared to the other authors, like younger from him and like around the area, I choose Duchnovich, Fencik, and also Diachenko, like dictionaries. I try to geographically and find the most the personalities were writing about this. But the Church-Slavonic part also has its peculiarities. Thus, we can evaluate that he uses more Greekisms, not only in the Latin, but also in the Church-Slavonic text. For example, Prospora. Basilovich uses prospora, but others are using different, like example, proscura. Or eulogium. Basilovich translates as antidor or eulogium. This is transcription to Church Slavic. Others are using agiasma, or they don't know this word. Narthex, like a part of a church, he's transcribing the narthex. The others don't use it. Very interesting are also words like about identity. For example, Catholicus is translating like Katoličeský or Pravoslavný or Orthodoxný. And others are usually using Pravoslavno-Katoličeský. But it's a lot of differently, but it's a big theme about these words. Processio, he's using processia. Other authors, they usually use kresný chod. Eulogium, sacristia, sacristia, it's from Latin. The others, Slavic, they use diaconicon, purificatorium, purificatorium. Others use huba or huba greckaja or lention. Dalmatica, he translates as stichar or dalmatica. Others are using podriznik or stichar. So we see he is very specific also in terminology. But it's the thing is not only how he was using terminology. Interesting was what he has chosen from other authors to educate his students. For example, when he's talking about processio, we see the translation in whole work, like litia, processia, ischoždenie, obchoždenie is in different ways. We can see the Latin lexeme processio is translated with several Church-Slavonic variants. The substantive processio can be derived from verba procedere, to proceed, to advance. Processions were already known in Imperial Rome. And what's most important is that he describes the procession of the Patriarch of Moscow and notes the magnificence of these processions. In Latin dictionaries, the lexeme processio is usually given as procession. Basilovich meanings, he's describing how should procession works, what they should wear, very, very detailedly, he writes about it, but what is very important is that why he's using so many, for example, synonyms between these. We can see on more places that the terminology wasn't like stable. They didn't know maybe how should procession work, or they did it wrong. So he's writing just to mention, nowadays the Greek Catholics are using terminology as processia. So we see the other authors didn't use this word, and he started like to use it, and it works until today. So another word is, for example, navis. Navis is also from Latin environment. It means part of the church, the middle part of the church. It depends, somebody divides church on 3 parts, somebody on 2 parts. But he was also the first one who was starting to use in the church Slavonic part, navis as korabel. What does it mean? Sometimes he say like korabel, and he puts just cerkve, part of the church. So he's like explaining what does it mean, and with comparison with other authors, is also the first one who starts to use it. It's very in a semantical way and practical way. He says who in the church where is supposed to stay. For example, the faithful entering the temple represents the ushers who are to take their place at the direction of the diacons. The diacons, like sailors on a ship, are to be dressed in light clothes and to circulate around the temple, and as servants of the captain to oversee the order of the people. Okay. So, conclusion. very funny thing is about when he is using like practical things, he's saying very often about the practice in our church, and he is not afraid to say that it's different from Greek, right? In some way, for example, we are using timpanabulum, zvonok, and he always says like with the small letters, so people don't sleep. For example, he first of all he puts like a theological, and then he says like, so they don't laugh, then they talk, you should do this, like very practical. It's very practical. You see, he's talking like mže rosiane, nos varuteni, tintinabulo. We are using tintinabulo for attention. Greek are not using this. They are using like this discourse with star. This work was also Basilovich points to the continuity that has lasted until the present day, despite social, historical, and religious changes, and was an inspiration for later liturgists such as Anton Čopej, Zeltaj, or Mikuláš Rusnak. It's very important to work with parallel texts for terminology because in Slovakia it's not still stable, and there are big discussions between Orthodox Church and Greek Catholic Church and about what was the first and second. And this comparison helps us to better understand and to better translate also the historical texts. Like, for example, we saw Pravoslavny or Roman. So for bigger impact of this work, we need wider geographical and chronological research in comparison with other authors in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.